Welcome to Social Work 338, module number 9. We are getting close to the end of this semester, and I'm going to move my camera over to the middle a little bit. And so here is our module that's going to focus on both juvenile justice and substance use and substance use disorders for juveniles. We are in the home stretch. This module is going to look at both of those issues together. There is a good amount of overlap, particularly because the way that I'm teaching it, we're going to look at brain and brain development, impact on the brain, and then look at that and add an understanding of drugs and the impact on the developing brain of adolescents. I just wanted to say a couple words. I'm almost done. I think I have 3 more of your midterms to read. You looked at how multiple systems that were involved in children's lives, because that's the basis of the systems of care model. And there is a little bit of confusion when we say systems of care. That's a very specific model. When we talk about just service delivery systems, those are a little bit different, but obviously they overlap in this model. So we've already looked at economic support systems, so you can think of the policies that manage income support for people, food stamps, TANF, Social Security. All of those are income support policies, and most of them in general are designed to prevent and address poverty. We looked at the education system. We looked at systems around children with disabilities, and again, because they're children, education and disabilities really overlap a little bit. And then we looked at the mental health system. So for this unit, we're going to look at the juvenile justice system, but we're also going to look at substance abuse and substance use disorder. Often substance use is considered part of the mental health system, but it is very unique, and especially with adolescents. So I just wanted to say a couple words about that because it's confusing when we talk about systems, what we mean, and it has to be defined actually each and every time. So there is overlap, and we do need to make those definitions about what a system is. And then as we're beginning, systems of care was the first model that we really looked at that tried to integrate those things. And as you are going through this model and the child welfare model, which is going to come up next, I hope you will be listening for some of the same themes, those principles of the systems of care model. Hopefully you're going to see them in many of the things that we're going to talk about in this module, and certainly in the child welfare module. And each of those systems and how we get them to work together, or how sometimes they don't work together, is really an overarching theme of this class. So we have lots of different steps for this module. We have the first thing that you're going to do is not read the text this time, but to watch a video by Jill Bolt Taylor on the adolescent brain. And as we're focusing in on this brain stuff and brain development, it really provides an overall context for everything that we are going to think about during this unit. So I thought we should start with that. As always, I really would encourage you to do these resources in the order that they're here. I've carefully thought about them, and I think the information builds from one to the next. So I suggest that you do that. Then you can read your Chapter 9 on juvenile justice. A lot of good information, a great overview. Then I've provided a link to the web page for the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. This act provides the very basis of juvenile justice policy in our nation. And so there's just a general history. Some of this is covered in your chapter, but another look at that. Then I have given you a long and very comprehensive reading called Roadmap to an Ideal Juvenile Justice System. I would like you to skim through that. You don't have to give it a hard read, but again, this is a place where it's going to provide some basic principles for what an ideal juvenile justice system would look like. I think you will see some overlap between these principles and the systems of care principles that we studied in the last unit, or 2 units ago. After you visit that that website, I'd like you to visit the Georgetown Crossover Youth page, which is a program of the Center for Youth at Georgetown University. And there are 2 short videos on this page. One is right at the top. The other you have to scroll all the way down for. But I would like you to scroll through that and read and hear about the case of Devon. Because it's very interesting and I think makes some good points. Now, then after you've done these juvenile justice things, I'd like you to go ahead and go back and read chapter 8 in your text, which is on substance abuse and youth. And so again, you're going to have some of the background of the juvenile justice system first. Again, I'm not sure why the authors decided to put them in the other order. I think they work better in this order, but you know, what can I say? Then there is another TED Talk on the adolescent brain and drugs. And so I'd like you to watch that and think about that a little bit. The last thing that I'm going to have you do is there's a podcast about 25 minutes from the National Institute for Drug Abuse, and they have what they call an ABCD study. It's really interesting. There's lots of other information on that webpage that you may want to look at, but I'd like you to listen to the podcast, and then there's a discussion post for this unit. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the steps. In this, again, I've already emphasized that we're really looking at adolescence and brain development. And it's very interesting because the brain development really looks at the period of time of adolescence being all the way from maybe 12 or 13 years up to 23 years of age. So depending on how your brain has been developing, you are likely to still be considered an adolescent based on your brain development. It has to do with the synapses and how everything connects together. I think in my own life, I was not a fast brain developer. I don't think it had anything to do with intelligence, but again, I think the video by Jill Bolt Taylor does a really nice job. And I am going to ask you about some of the things that she talks about in that video in your discussion. So you may want to take some notes on that, or certainly look at the discussion assignment before you watch it. For a long time, we've known that adolescents are sort of a special stage of development. You might have taken Psych 160 and you learned about those stages of development across the life cycle. But it really is now that we're able to see these brains and brain scans and see how the brain develops, that it's really providing the evidence, the hard evidence for these developmental periods that we've known about in psychology for a long time. So some really interesting stuff. And I think increasingly as we learn about this adolescent brain development, it really has the power to influence our public policy making for adolescents in the juvenile justice system. So after you've seen the video, again, now it's time to read the chapter. I have to begin by paying tribute to the author of this chapter, Dr. Bill Barton, who was a colleague of mine. He passed away last year. I had worked with him many years at Indiana University on many projects relating to youth. He and I were involved in a project at the Marion County Juvenile Center to try to reduce bias in who got detained, who got locked up in the juvenile center, to provide structured decision making to try to take racial bias out of that. And it really had some very good impacts. So he was a great man, truly a gentleman and a scholar. So I have to give it up to Dr. Barton because he was very supportive of me in my early career, and I appreciate all his work very much. This chapter is an excellent overview. It has some good information on the history of juvenile justice. It hasn't been that long that we've treated juveniles differently in the justice system, and I think it was recently I'm going to talk about that in the next section. The Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act was recently reauthorized in 2018. This is a contentious time in our government, but there was bipartisan support for this. So I'd like you to read about the act, and there's a click here for more information. I'd like you to click on that page as well to look at both of these pages. They're not overly complex, but they do provide an overview of the most important points of the basis of our juvenile justice system. Then there is rather a lengthy article. It's not an article, it's like I don't know what you'd call it. It's not quite a book, it's not an article. What's in between? It's long. And it's called The Roadmap to an Ideal Juvenile Justice System. This document provides what these authors say are the principles of an ideal system that would encourage rehabilitation for youth who break the law. So as you're skimming through this text, I'd like you to try to identify those principles that line up with the principles of the systems of care model, because there is definitely some overlap here. I also want to alert you that I will be asking you to discuss one of the model programs that's discussed in this reading, so you might want to be looking for those, taking notes, because you're going to talk about that in your discussion. Then there is a web page that is put together by the Massachusetts General Hospital Center of Law, the Brain, and Behavior. And it's specifically related to juvenile justice and the adolescent brain. Again, our new understanding of brain development for adolescents, I believe, should influence our public policy. And one of the issues that really stands out to me is the issue of waiving youth, some of them as young as 8, 10, 12 years old, to adult court. As you might tell, I'm against that policy, and I am delighted that some of the new research on brain development is providing some, I believe, hard evidence that should influence public policy around this issue. So I'd like you to read it, think about how you feel. There's some other issues embedded in there. So I think this is a nice website and a very important topic as we look at juvenile justice and children and families. Then I would also like you to go to a web page that's developed by Georgetown University, their Center on Practice Reform in Juvenile Justice. And this is called the Georgetown Crossover Youth Project. This is really looking at how children who often start out in the child welfare system are much more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, and clearly there's a relationship. The trauma that they experienced through their own abuse and neglect, and then the fact that they end up doing things that hurt themselves or, frankly, some other people as well, and how we should manage that, knowing that there is this crossover. Some people say it's up to 75% of kids in the juvenile justice system have a history in the child welfare system. So really interesting for us to think about this and really take that into account as we're figuring out how we manage children. There are 2 short videos on this page. Please watch the first one that sort of describes an overview of the project, and then you can scroll down to the bottom and there's another video that talks a little bit about the case example of Devon. So I think you'll like that. Alrighty, now we're ready. Oop, I skipped ahead there. Can I not go back? That's weird. Anyway, the first part of working with the substance abuse is to read the chapter in your text on substance use and adolescence youth. And then the next step is to watch a video, another TED Talk, that focuses on adolescent brain development and drugs. And so the two of them are complementary to each other, but I think it's important to think about what happens when you have these adolescent development issues in the brain, and then you add drugs and alcohol and other substances into the mix. We're almost to the end. I think this is the last step. Then I would like you to listen to a podcast. The podcast is about 25 minutes. It's from the National Institute on Drug Addiction, Drug Abuse, Drug Addiction. Actually, I should know that. It's NIDA. That I know. And they're doing some interesting research called the ABCD study. And so I think this has great relevance to helping us understand adolescence and drug abuse. And hopefully it will give you some really important information. And as our country is looking at the issues of, for example, marijuana legalization, of course, the legalization involves adults, which is usually 18 and over. But what does this mean for youth and adolescents and the negative impacts of drug use and abuse on these developing brains? So some interesting, and NIDA is one of the premier research organizations in substance use and substance use disorders. So it's a good place to get some great information on cutting edge research. Okay, then we are to the discussion post. After you've watched, read, listened to all of the materials, I'd like you to write a discussion that addresses how you understand adolescent brain development and that substance use and abuse or juvenile delinquency, how those things interact. Some of the questions that I would like you to answer are, what are the factors, using information from the TED Talk by Jill Bolt Taylor, that create specific risks for adolescents? We've talked about a resilience model and the risk and protective factors. So what are the micro level or the individual level risks related to adolescents based on their brain development? I'd like you to be specific here. Please discuss the changes in the different parts of the brain that are occurring during adolescence and how they can be impacted by substance use and juvenile delinquency. There's some great information there to think about. Then I'd like you to think about how this emerging knowledge about brain development may impact policy development for both substance abuse and or juvenile delinquency. So you can pick one and discuss that. What should we be doing differently in these systems to reduce both adolescent substance abuse and juvenile delinquency? What can we do differently? What based on this knowledge? And again, try to be specific in how what we know about adolescents and their brains would impact our efforts in both prevention and intervention. So that's something to think about. And then finally, I'd like you to choose one of those model programs, or what they call principles in action, from the roadmap for creating an ideal juvenile justice system, and give a brief overview of the model program that you chose. Provide a brain development informed rationale of why might this program be successful in reducing juvenile delinquency. So I can tell that you are increasing your knowledge on this. Then, as always, read and comment on two classmates and comment on people that chose a different model program from the one that you chose. That's about it. This is a packed module, and the next one on child welfare, which I know many of you have specific interests in, and I think you will enjoy it as well. It's also pretty packed with some information. But as always, if you have questions, please email me. I've had a chance to talk to some of you online or by email, and I truly enjoy that. I felt like overall your midterm papers were strong. They showed good knowledge. I hope you have chosen your book that you're going to be reading for the final paper. That book will serve as a case example, just like the Kids in Crisis video did. And I will be asking you to talk about similar things in the final exam, in your final paper, based on your book. Hope you are staying safe, being careful, washing your hands, wearing your mask. I have mine right here that I'm going to put on because I'm going to be leaving soon. So take care and be safe, and I look forward to reading your post. Thank you.